when we say we're restoring to a stage zero condition, we're not trying to go backwards and say that's how the river was and that's how it will be again. When you reconnect a river to its valley, when you give it back multiple channels, you give it so many degrees of freedom that it can accommodate shocks. It can evolve in response to step changes in any variable and adapt. You give it the maximum adaptive capacity. And that's the best thing we can do for our rivers, because the future is not uncertain. It's unknowable because it hasn't happened yet. And these multi-channel systems don't have, like Richard Hay said, a single thread river has 9 degrees of freedom. 3-channel river has 27 degrees of freedom. That gives you about 13 million combinations of response that it can do. It can deal with the future if you give it the space and you give it the opportunity.
Hello, my name's Cray with the International Water Training Institute on behalf of the Australian Water School. Welcome to today's webinar titled Let It Flow, Let It Flow. This is about the Stage Zero approach to river restoration. We'll be joined by some expert presenters today, but in the meantime, let me first welcome you, our attendees, coming to us from a truly global spread today. Look at this, around the world. Thank you for tuning in today, especially to those who may not be in optimal time zones. We have 5 expert presenters on with us today, and in the background, we've got Chris Goodell, a familiar face. If you could all turn your cameras on, let us know, I guess, where you're coming to us from and what brought you here and what you do. So let's start kind of in order as we see it there on the screen. Let's introduce for the first time, inaugural appearance here on the Australian Water School's webinars, Grady Hillhouse. Let's start with Grady. Let us know, again, where you're coming to us from today and what do you do?
Sure. Howdy. My name's Grady. I am coming from San Antonio, Texas, and I am an author and an independent video producer. I run a YouTube channel called Practical Engineering, where we talk about the built environment and infrastructure, basically.
Excellent. Well, we're excited to have Grady on today to show us a couple of things on how to best convey this information, especially to those who may be new to the sciences that we'll be exploring today. Now, in the order of the presentations today, let's go in that order as we introduce ourselves. Colin, again, where are you coming to us from today and what do you do?
Hello, I'm Colin Thorne. I'm in Vancouver, Washington, and I'm the Emeritus Professor of Physical Geography at the University of Nottingham.
Great. Excellent. Well, welcome to you. Paul, over to you next.
Hello, I'm Paul Powers. I'm a fisheries biologist with the U.S. Forest Service in Bend, Oregon.
Bend, Oregon. Excellent. Next on the list, we have Kate Meyer. Let's hear from you.
Hi there. I'm also a fisheries biologist with the U.S. Forest Service, like Paul.
Excellent. And where are you coming to us from today?
I'm coming from Bend, Oregon.
Also from Bend. Excellent. And Janine, over to you.
Hello, I'm Janine Castro. I'm a geomorphologist with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and I'm coming to you from Vancouver, Washington.
Thanks. All right. And a familiar face in the background, if you give us a wave, Chris. Chris Goodell in the background will be answering your technical questions. We tend to come from a bit of a modeling background in terms of the audience distribution. If you have questions about how to model the things that you see demonstrated today, Chris will answer some of those questions in the background. Now, Grady is going to give us a bit of an introduction. And if you want a longer introduction, I'll share some links with you here shortly after the presentations, where you can see a full 1-hour interview between Chris and Grady on the RAS Solution channel, part of the Full Momentum vodcast. And Chris gets into Grady's background and where he's, how his career took him from being a civil engineer to being a full-time, not just a YouTuber, but full-time presenter and podcaster, basically putting out content for general engineering items. So with that, Grady, we're going to have you introduce this first. Each of the speakers will come on momentarily with their own presentations, but let's hear a little bit about how we can demonstrate these concepts and your trip to the M River, is it, that you went to, and what you learned there, and how that can help our audience today, who is generally new to river restoration. So over to you, Grady.
Cool. Thank you, Craig, for that really nice introduction. I just have kind of a super cut of a lot of the footage we shot. So I'll just kind of let this play while I talk about this. As I mentioned, my main gig right now is producing videos on the Practical Engineering YouTube channel. And I had the pleasure of visiting the headquarters of this little company in Carbondale, Illinois, here in the US, called MRiver. And this was the brainchild of a fluvial geomorphologist by the name of Steve Goff. And one of his jobs when he was working for the state of Missouri was trying to educate ranchers and loggers and farmers and sand mining companies about how those industries could affect the behavior of rivers. So he developed this really simple teaching tool, basically a sandbox with a water pump, to make these concepts easier to share. And these have come a long way from a crude sandbox in many ways, but really, it really is fairly straightforward, right? It's a pump at the top, a drain at the bottom, and granular media in the middle. And the result, I think, is pretty remarkable. Definitely something that grabs your attention immediately. And as far as I'm aware, these tables, they really aren't used for research that much. I'm not a geologist, unlike a lot of people on this call. But, I did some scale hydraulic modeling of spillways in my consulting days, so I can at least appreciate the challenge of trying to accurately model sediment transport phenomena at this scale. There might be some practical applications, but mostly these are used as a teaching tool, right? And for conveying information about the dynamic nature of rivers, I think these tables are just really, really powerful visual tools. Pretty much any geomorphic feature of a stream system can be seen in these tables. Oxbows, point bars, differences in headwaters versus depositional zones, and a whole lot more. And they have a wave generator for coastal processes and a rainfall generator to model runoff. But the big thing is that you see these features evolve and erode in real time. And most importantly, you get to just see that rivers are constantly changing and evolving, which I think is one of those big conceptual leaps that a lot of people, people who haven't been exposed to the topic of geomorphology have to make. And any change you make, you get to play with this. And any change you make to the conditions of the table, the flow, the slope, adding engineered features, those changes trickle through the model in a way that's easy to observe. And the consequences to those changes aren't always intuitive, as many of you know. So as a teaching tool, it's not only interesting, but it's often surprising, which is a really hard thing to do in education sometimes. The second video in the series that we produced at MRiver was called Why Engineers Can't Control Rivers, which I admit is a little bit hyperbolic. That's the industry that I'm in. But the thesis of the video was that anytime you make a change to a river system, there are impacts on the sediment transport phenomena within the system. Sometimes it happens upstream, sometimes downstream, sometimes it happens quickly, sometimes slowly. But these are lessons that we've learned the hard way many times over across the world. And the stream table just does such a nice job of showing why that's the case. And that's one of the reasons why it just made such nice video content. The granular media that you see there is actually different sizes of ground up plastic, which is kind of the secret to the whole thing, right? Those particles are just lighter than sand or gravel, which kind of speeds up the sediment transport processes. So you can see this happen over the course of a short lecture rather than having to set up a time-lapse camera and run this in the lab over the course of a few days. And it's kind of funny, that they're using microplastics to teach people about the environment, but they're pretty careful about it. All the sinks have netting, so you don't wash the media down into the drain, and they keep the floors in their headquarters immaculately clean. Unfortunately, the founder, Steve, died a few years back, but his wife, Catherine, keeps the operation running, and they have a small team that's constantly developing new products, marketing the stream tables at conferences, and manufacturing and shipping these tables around the world, mostly to universities. So, this isn't meant to be an advertisement. I think there are probably other companies that make these as well, but I'm just thankful that they invited me to their facility to produce some really cool videos about the tables. And if you work for a university or a science museum or an agency that does any kind of public education around rivers, you should definitely consider this type of physical model because they just tell a really nice story, and they really kind of cement those geomorphic concepts into people's minds easily. So just wanted to share that. Thanks, Gray, and everyone for having me on the call, and I'll pass it on to the next presenter.
Thanks. And Grady will be in the background. If you have any Q&A questions for him, feel free to put those into the Q&A line. And I'll share some YouTube links with you. You would have seen it on the registration page as well to the 2 videos that Grady has talked about. Colin, if you want to start sharing your screen already, again, those stream tables are used in the geomorphology course that we have through the Australian Water School as well. Similar stream tables to just help nail down some of these concepts. We've all played around with with these sorts of things in a sandbox or on the beach, and so we want to make sure we take it from that introductory kind of kindergarten exposure to these things into some of the harder science that's behind this and why it's so difficult to make some of these predictions. So with that, we'll turn it over to Colin. In the background, everybody else will be answering Q&A questions, so keep those questions coming. Colin, I can see your screen just fine, and then we'll just proceed through in that order. So over to you.
Well, hello again, everybody. It's my job today to introduce the idea and definition of stage 0 and tell you a little bit about where that idea came from and what the theory behind it is. But in a nutshell, stage 0 is a kind of shorthand. It's a shorthand for fully reconnecting the river to its wetlands, floodplains, and hypoaeric aquifer. And that full connectivity is incredibly important. And you may have noticed in the stream table how rarely the river was confined to a single channel. And here we see 2 reaches of the South Fork McKenzie River in Oregon, which Kate is going to show you a lot more about in a little while. The upper one is in the fully reconnected, rehydrated floodplain, and the lower picture is a bit upstream where the river was channelized and forced into a single thread. Now, where the channel is fully connected to its floodplain, we see wetland and riparian plants in the floodplain. We see the water table at or near the surface, and we see a sediment deposition environment. This is an area where we have slow water, and we have time for plants and animals to interact with it and use it usefully. But in the disconnected floodplain system, we see upland species instead of wetland species in the floodplain. We see an increased depth to the water table because that incised ditch pulls the water table down with it. And we see a sediment transport environment, often described around here as a fire hose, because any sediment that is in that channel is simply flushed through it at a high rate of speed. And it doesn't stay around long enough to provide habitat or other benefits. Now, my interest in incised channels and the evolution of channel floodplain systems really started in the late 1970s when I was based at the National Sedimentation Laboratory in Oxford, Mississippi. And at that time in North Mississippi, a lot of stream systems were simply falling apart, like Crowder Creek here. And to get an idea of how bad that incision and rapid widening is, that's a big American car. That's a Ford LTD. It's probably nearly 5 meters long. And here it is dropped into this terrible canyon that is draining the water out of the pasture, ruining it for grazing, and just destroying the valley bottom. Well, such was the scale and extent of this severe channel instability that 3 of the leading geomorphologists of their time, Stanley Shum, Mike Harvey, and Chester Watson, who were then based at Colorado State University, were invited to Mississippi to try and work out what on earth was going on. And having studied it for several years, they then wrote a book. The book is still in print. You can still buy a copy today. Incised Channels, Their Morphology, Dynamics, and Control. And in that book, Shum, Harvey, and Watson put forward the first channel evolution model. And it's a 5-stage model. It starts with the pre-disturbance natural channel, stage 1. That then incises or degrades for a variety of reasons, often because of dredging or straightening or lowering of the base level. But that degradation oversteepens and overheightens the banks, and the channel blows out sideways in stage 3. Eventually, it gets so wide that material starts to accumulate in the floor of that canyon that's been cut, and the banks begin to relax back to more reasonable angles. And then in stage 5, stability returns and a new regime channel adjusted to the hydraulics and the sediment load develops within the incised canyon. And for more than 20 years, the channel evolution model was viewed as a template for channel restoration and channel stabilization in incised and degrading streams. Not just in North America, but around the world. But that world changed in 2008 with the publication by Walter and Miritz in Science of a paper that challenged the idea that the natural form for a channel floodplain system was a single thread channel with about a 2-year return period that only occasionally flooded its floodplain. And what Walter and Miritz, working in some of the creeks that Leopold Woolman and Miller had worked in 30 years, 40 years previously, Watts Branch, Seneca Creek, Brandywine Creek, what they showed was that that floodplain surface was actually a recent feature dating from 1850, and that the natural floodplain, the Holocene floodplain, was buried under several meters of post-settlement alluvium. And when they looked at the makeup of that original natural floodplain, they came to the conclusion that before European settlement, the streams were small anabranching channels with extensive vegetated wetlands. And that incised stream then was not the natural starting point for the channel evolution model because it was already impacted. That set me and Brian Kluwer thinking, and in 2013, we proposed the stream evolution model, a respectful upgrade of the channel evolution model. But we didn't want to lose the numbering sequence that so many people knew and loved. So how do we put a precursor stage in before stage 1? Well, we called it stage 0, and that's where the name comes from. It's the pre-disturbance state that Walter and Miritz realized was the true natural configuration of the channel. And then we went through stages 1 to 5 just the same, but we also added some late stage developments where the incised stream pushes the shoulders of that canyon out and creates enough space in the new incised floor for an anastomose multi-thread channel to reform. Well, why is this important? And here was Brian's big contribution, because he showed how the hydrogeomorphic attributes of the channel and the habitat and ecosystem benefits it provides collapse as you incise and widen it. And the pies here, the size of the pie is the abundance of that attribute and ecosystem benefit. And the number of pie pieces is the diversity of attributes and ecosystem benefits. And you can see generally, as you get down from stage 1 through to stages 2, 3, 4, and 5, you lose those attributes and benefits. But fortunately, as the channel recovers, you do get a lot of them back. So in terms of restoration goals and management objectives to optimize the attributes and benefits, we want to be up and to the left in this diagram and not down and to the right. Now, that's a kind of quick run through then of how we got to stage 0. And stage 0 is simply the initial pre-disturbance condition in the channel, in the stream evolution model. But it's characterized by an abundance and a wide range of hydromorphic attributes and ecosystem benefits, by high fluvial complexity, and by full connectivity between the river, its wetlands, its floodplains, and its aquifer. And that's the bare bones of what stage 0 is, but it's also a philosophy because it's about thinking outside the channel, realizing the domain of the river is much bigger than the channel of the river. And I'll hand over to Paul Powers at that point.
Excellent. Just a reminder to keep those Q&A questions in the background. Paul, you can go ahead and start sharing your screen. Thanks for that introduction, Colin. I think that definitely brings it home for some of those who may get a little bit overwhelmed going to that Stage 0 data hub that we gave everybody the links to. That gives everybody a great introduction. So Paul, yep, I can see your screen. If you want to go to full screen on that, we're looking at the PDF version. There we go. Perfect. Over to you, Paul.
Perfect. So thank you so much, Colin and Craig. What I want to do in this next session is just give you a really brief introduction into some of the key elements that we're using when we're interpreting it and interpreting these river valleys and then coming up with our restoration design. So this will be very introductory. So if you do want more, please get a hold of us. Advance for me. So practitioners like Kate and I and Janine, Colin, our colleagues, we often get invited out to sites that look like the inset image at bottom right there. And a lot of times we'll walk out to that site with the local folks and we'll walk up to the bank. Everyone stands there with hands on hips and kind of has a generally disappointed look on their face. And they'll turn to us and ask for advice or recommendations on how do you restore this river. And it's a bit of a difficult, it's simple, but it's kind of difficult. The answer to that is hard. Does restoration mean you're stabilizing that eroding bank, or does it mean you're adding habitat elements or complexity and diversity to it by building log jams and such? Or is planting that riparian vegetation up on the floodplain restoration? So it can be any and all of those things, or a little bit more. So to answer that and show kind of how we evaluate these riverscapes, we're going to step back a little bit and look at this valley and try to understand some of the geomorphic features within it. So this is about 6 kilometers of river valley flowing from left to right. And what I want to show is what we do is try to find the full valley extent. And we're mapping out features that impinge on the valley floor, such as confluence fans and such, marked in orange here, and then drawing a center line through the true valley floor and profiling that. And that's what you see in the upper graph is that we have, when you profile these valleys, you see these distinct hinge points where you transition from a depositional valley like that shown in valley segment 3C into more of a transport valley. So once we have those, we can develop what we call a relative elevation model for each of these individual valley segments, which kind of helps us see a lot of those features that the stream table was illustrating so well. So I want to spend just a minute on this slide, and I think when we show these relative elevation models, they're not that intuitive for a lot of folks. So in panel B, you see a relative elevation model. And what I'm going to do is use that Rosetta Stone and translate this to a cross-section. I think people have used cross-sections for a very long time to understand river valleys and connectivity between features. So you'll notice in the panel B, I've got a cross-section going across there with numbers 1 through 10 on it. And then that same cross-section is displayed in the graph at top. And so if we look at the cross-section, you'll notice that at point 1, the valley dips a little bit into the lighter blue colors. And if we look down at the relative elevation map in panel B, we see that this is showing us a historic wetland feature against the valley toe slope. As we move right, that's the location at station 2, that's the location of the current river. And then the mapped riverbed, survey riverbed, is that orange dot. So it's a little over 2 meters below the geomorphic grade line where we would expect the riverbed to be here. And so as we slide further across, you'll see points 6, 7, 8, and 9. Those represent that historic river bed before the incision happened. So if we're talking to the stage 0 condition that Colin pointed out to us, that shows us where the river had lived at that time. And then those points of shown with 10, those are going to represent those vegetated islands that would have existed between those historic flow paths. Now, in the current condition with those riparian plantings, a lot of times you'll see that those aren't doing so well. And that has a direct correspondence to the depth to the shallow groundwater. So in our current conditions, the groundwater is going to be lower, like Colin showed us, and so those plants aren't going to do so well. When we implement the stage 0 projects, we're bringing that shallow groundwater all the way up to that geomorphic grade line, we call it, which now the riparian dependent vegetation has its feet in the water, and you'll get that robust riparian vegetation growth. So you'll see examples of this in Kate's presentation. So back to that original slide we started with, what does restoration for this site look like? Well, the beauty of this mapping is that it allows us to paint that REM onto this landscape and get a better idea of what those relic or reference conditions would have looked like. So our reference stage 0 valley is painted for us in all these areas that are shown in blue. Whereas the current river channel, which is shown in pink here, is in a stage 3 or 4 condition. So it shows us both what the degradation is, but also what the restoration potential is. So taking this site and applying the stage 0 river restoration to it would look something like this that we see right here. And so this is the river restoration, excuse me, to the stage 0 condition for this given river valley. And what we see here is a lot of the complexity and diversity that Colin shared in his presentation. Everything from single thread channels all the way to beaver wetland ponds. We've got springbrook heads and a huge suite of complexity and diversity across this landscape. And with that, I will turn it over to Kate.
All right. So yeah, so for about 10 minutes, I'm going to try to immerse you in a completed stage 0 project on the South Fork McKenzie River in Oregon, show you how we gave the river back to its valley, and summarize some of the published findings that we're seeing so far. This is a bare earth LiDAR image of the McKenzie River and the South Fork coming together and actually sharing the same valley for over 3 kilometers. This is a low gradient, unconfined valley, about 1.6 kilometers wide. And you can see at some point in the past, this had an interconnected web of channels and floodplain, what we call an anastomosing river wetland corridor, and it was in fact an ecological hotspot. Well, due to anthropogenic alterations, we now have 2 separate rivers that have been channelized into mostly single threads, which then led to degradation, disconnection from the floodplain, and ultimately into stage 3S of the stream evolution model, arrested degradation, where a river gets stuck in its degraded state. Colin likes to call these zombie rivers. They're sort of a half-dead version of their former selves. To free this poor zombie river, we use the geomorphic grade line methodology that Paul mentioned to lift that degraded channel back up to its floodplain. And really, it's a very simple design concept. You cut the artificial features, the berms, the blockages, use that material to fill the degraded channel and add a lot of wood all over the valley. Here's what that looks like under construction. So we temporarily diverted the whole river out of the channels to allow for the cut and fill activities to take place in the dry. And then once that's completed and wood is placed and buried, then we turn the water back onto the project. So this project, it's an 80-hectare project, and it immediately resulted in a 4-fold increase in wetted area at base flow. So that's pretty remarkable. Here's what the project looked like 1 year later, with the water table back up at the historic valley surface. You can see some of the trees dying from getting drowned out by that raised water table, and they're in a transition back to a wetland riparian community. So now I'm going to run through some of the published findings. For streambed substrate, we measured a big shift from cobble and boulder dominant to gravel and fines dominant. This is really beneficial to fish like Chinook salmon, trout, and Pacific lamprey that need those gravels for spawning, and for larval lamprey that live in the fine sediment. Overall, we found that water temperatures did warm up a bit within the first 2 years, but that those temperatures should cool as vegetation and shade reestablishes. But we also found a high degree of variability in thermal regimes, meaning there is both warmer and cooler water, providing temperature diversity to support diverse flora and fauna. And those warm areas are very high in biological productivity. And there is now large patches of cold water that are connected or in close proximity to each other that provide important refugia for cold water species. An aquatic macroinvertebrate study found that within a year after restoration, the density, biomass, and diversity were already within the range of pre-restoration. And 2 to 3 years after restoration, they were significantly higher. A separate study found that macroinvertebrate production 1 year after restoration was a little bit lower than the unrestored reach on a per square meter basis, but there were 3 times more production when scaled to that wetted area. So this all indicates really rapid recolonization and recovery of macroinvertebrates following the construction disturbance. We conducted an environmental DNA study from water samples to look at biodiversity and found that species richness was orders of magnitude higher post-restoration at 2 of the 3 transects. And there was an increasing trend in species richness post-restoration. So things are only going to get better. The bars in this graph show the number of Chinook salmon redds or egg nests in the lower South Fork McKenzie over the last 2 decades, with total redds in the whole McKenzie watershed on the secondary axis in red there. Immediately after phase 2 was completed, we saw a huge spike in redds, and since that year, counts within the project have remained high. And now about 10 to 20% of the total redds in the watershed are found in the project area, even though it only makes up 1.5% of the area surveyed. So Chinook salmon are disproportionately utilizing the project area for spawning. A carbon sequestration study found that total estimated organic carbon stocks from wood and soil was greater in the restored reach compared to the unrestored reach and compared to a reference reach on another well-functioning river. This project is proving to be quite resilient to flooding. Here's the project area at 85 cubic meters per second. And the inset photo was taken upstream of the project at a lower discharge. So you can really see the difference in that energy dissipation, where upstream is functioning as a transport reach and the project area is now a depositional reach, providing high flow refuge for critters and retaining a lot more water on site. In 2020, the Holiday Farm Fire started during a historic wind event with winds of 80 to 160 kilometers per hour for 3 days straight. The fire eventually grew to 70,000 hectares, along with several other mega fires in Oregon's worst fire season on record. The map at the bottom right shows the fire area within the McKenzie River watershed. And the areas in red in that map have over 75% vegetation mortality. So this was a very fast moving hot fire that consumed almost all of the vegetation. I was assigned to work on the fire 2 days after it started. This photo was taken the first day I was able to get to the South Fork project area. I had no idea how it fared, and I was really nervous to find out. It was a huge relief as I walked up and I saw green vegetation, unburned in-stream wood, and unconsumed standing cottonwoods. In contrast to what I had been seeing elsewhere, it looked like an oasis. It was the only place where we actually saw and heard birds for days to come, and salmon continued to spawn for the duration of that fire. As the smoke cleared and we saw more of the fire area, some patterns started to emerge. where there was more hydrologic connectivity and geomorphic and vegetative complexity. The fire burned more as a mosaic, like the photo on top at the South Fork. Where there was less connectivity and simplified degraded channels, the fire burned more intensely and uniformly, like the two photos on the bottom. These patterns instigated a fire resilient study led by Colin and Britt Pugh and others. A perspective piece has been published, and further studies will explore the concept that pyrodiversity begets biodiversity, and that floodplain reconnection projects enhance both resilience and resistance of river ecosystems to wildfire. So to summarize, we're just starting to learn about how these stage 0 projects unfold, but the early results are extremely compelling. And they're even cooler to see in person. So I'm personally inviting all you folks across the world to come see these projects for yourselves. And I'll pass it on to Janine.
Excellent. Now in the background again, now Janina, you can start sharing your screen. Look, this will be our last presentation for the day, and then we'll turn it over to the whole panel. I just want to let you know again, we tend to get everybody asking a lot of questions right toward the end. We've got plenty of awesome questions that have been answered already on text, and we'll cover some of those live on our session. But do take advantage of this. If you've watched any of Grady's videos with millions and millions of views, a singular opportunity here to have some direct interactive Q&A with Grady and with our other experts here. So keep those questions coming. We'll come back to you in about 10 minutes time with a panel discussion going through those that are upvoted the most. So upvote those that you see that you'd like to hear us discuss. So with that, I can see your screen just fine. Janine, you're coming through all right. Let's turn it over to you.
So why do floodplains matter? Why does any of this matter? And why are hundreds of us here today to talk about floodplain connectivity and stage 0? And that's what I want to talk about today, because floodplains are an ecological nexus and they're extremely important. There are many species that rely on connected floodplains for all or part of their life history. And where actually most of us are from on the panel today in the Pacific Northwest part of the United States, salmon are very important. And you just heard that from Kate about how important that is. And salmon are so important that almost all of our recovery and restoration money that funds these projects is funded to support salmon recovery. And floodplains are important for salmon because salmon feed on floodplains, fish feed on floodplains. And we know this because there have been researchers throughout kind of Western North America, but really all over the world, doing studies on fish and seeing that if they can get out onto a floodplain when they're juveniles, when they're just small, and even for 3 weeks, that's the difference on these fish that you see. The only difference is the fish on the floodplain were out there for 3 weeks and they were able to feed in these large areas that were inundated. And so for salmon, if they can grow larger and faster and they're healthier, it gives them a big survival advantage when they go out to the ocean. So then we have more fish that come back. And we're seeing this pattern kind of repeating over and over, and this importance to fish in floodplains. But it's not just about fish. And it's not just about aquatic species either. There are lots of other species that are really dependent on these highly connected river wetland corridors. So it's the macroinvertebrates and the diatoms, it's the birds and the amphibians. But it's not just the species that are reliant directly on that aquatic system. It's the browsers and grazers, and it's the apex predators. It's the whole trophic cascade. They're really dependent on these important parts of our landscape. And this diagram, I really appreciate the authors, Hauer and others, who published this paper on floodplains as an ecological nexus, because they described floodplains as the most endangered landform. So the most endangered landform. That's a really powerful statement, because I work for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and I work with threatened and endangered species. So now we have our threatened and endangered species that are dependent on an endangered landform. So we have a lot of work cut out for us. But it's not just about fish and wildlife. It's about a whole host of other things as well. There are so many kind of beneficial attributes of these highly connected floodplain systems, these river wetland corridors. And some of them we know quite a bit about, and we've studied and we've been able to model them. So things like flood management, flood attenuation, water quality, particularly temperature, groundwater and groundwater recharge, and fish habitat that I just talked about. But there are emerging issues and concepts as well. So migratory pathways, flyways for birds, and the one that Kate just talked about, wildfire and wildfire behavior. And unfortunately, we are getting a lot more experience learning about how these connected floodplain systems interact with wildfire. But then there are all these other unanswered questions. There are things we just don't know. When we disconnected our floodplain systems and we disconnected these channels from their floodplains, we don't even know what we lost. And I don't know that we'll ever know what we'll gain when we reconnect them, but the area is just really ripe for more research. And unfortunately, we have bisected and dissected our river valleys and our floodplains for good reasons. Hydropower and flood management, for transportation, agriculture, development. I mean, we love living in floodplains, but so do a lot of other things. And so we've kind of learned that this is this shared space, and how do we manage it for a wide kind of variety of issues. And this is where I feel like floodplain reconnection, it's difficult, but it is possible. And I think that's the message that all of us here today, we really believe in, is that we're not arguing that we could do this everywhere, but it is a possibility. And we should always kind of keep that option open, because we have a big challenge in front of us. This is a study that came out for the United States a few years ago. And the researchers were looking at the amount of flow coming out of these various areas, various landscapes. And if we just focus on the Pacific Northwest part of the United States, and we look at that graph, the dashed line is the annual hydrograph. That's how much water is coming out of that landscape on average over a year. Now the green part below it, that 4.2%, that's the amount of flow that is not in a channel. So this is the flow that is up on a floodplain. Now, if you have species that are absolutely dependent on this floodplain connectivity, I think it's safe to say that 4.2% is not enough flow on the floodplain, that level of connectivity. So we don't really know what the number should be, but that number is definitely too low. And I don't think we're at any risk of kind of over connecting our systems, but there is an opportunity out there. So I just want to show a couple of examples. And for those of you who are in engineering and have done design in the past, I think this is just kind of two different ways of thinking about kind of restoration design. And so this lovely illustration comes out of a paper, River Wetland Corridors, that we published a few years ago. And it kind of shows this idealized river valley with some channels in the bottom. And if we take a channel design approach, and we kind of talked about this, like thinking inside of the channel, this is an inside out kind of approach. So we figure out, okay, we need to move a certain amount of water and we need to move some sediment through. And so I need to size my channel appropriately so that the water's deep enough and is moving fast enough to keep that sediment kind of transporting through the system. And once you do that, figure out the size of the channel, any water that's left, it can come over and spill over onto that floodplain. Now, unfortunately, what this often means is that water will only be on that floodplain surface maybe every few years, maybe for a few days, but not very much. And certainly if you're a fish, probably not long enough for you to get out there and feed. But this is really appropriate in a lot of areas, and we've used this quite successfully. And I'm not suggesting that we let go of it, but I think it's good to put it into context. So if we look at an example, and this is near Portland, Oregon, this is Johnson Creek. And Johnson Creek was moved into a single channel to the side of the valley in the 1930s because of flood management and flood control concerns. There was a decision made a number of years ago to reconnect this floodplain, but this is in a fairly urbanized area, so they had to do it carefully. So it was both for flood management and for salmon recovery. And so you'll see as this restoration project comes online, there's a single thread channel that is constructed. You can see the vegetation coming in, it starts recovering, but that channel doesn't move. It's not like the channels that Grady was showing you on the stream table that were moving all the time. This channel was designed to stay in place. And that is really appropriate for this particular landscape. But what if we take a different approach? And we're really interested in floodplains, floodplain connectivity and inundation, and floodplain saturation. So I like to call this the inside, kind of the outside in approach. So I just talked about the channel design being the inside out. Now we're going to go from the outside and we're going to think in. How much space do we have? How much floodplain do we have available that we can inundate? And how long can it be inundated? And we go through a floodplain design process, and the outcome is maybe a couple of channels, maybe one channel, or maybe no channels. But it is an outcome of the design process. It's not kind of the input. And then what would this look like? And this is Wychus Creek in Oregon. So in Central Oregon, and Wychus was essentially put into a ditch. It was straightened, so you can see the alignment there. And at this site, a floodplain approach was taken, a kind of restoration to a stage 0 condition. And so when we look at how this restoration project evolves, you can see that the whole valley bottom is occupied. The flow is spread out. You can see the channels etching into place now. But if you notice, they start moving around even over the first few years. And so as this project evolves, we expected those channels will continue to move. And this is a floodplain design approach. So this is just kind of another tool that is now available to us, but also just this kind of condition to be thinking about as an opportunity. So if you are interested in these types of approaches and you want to read a lot more about it, see what papers are out there, all the papers we've kind of discussed today, you can go to the Stage 0 Information Hub. There's a lot of information there, project information, and you can contribute as well. And so please take a look at that site and make some recommendations.
Awesome.
So floodplains matter because water matters. And in times of water scarcity or water abundance, floodplains support life. Thanks.
That is a great take-home statement there. Thanks so much to each of our presenters. If you could all turn your cameras back on again, we'll now have about 10-15 minutes where we can have some interactive Q&A. And as we're doing that, as you're getting your cameras on, let me just share quickly some additional resources that I've put together here for today's webinar. And you can see some background on the speakers here if you didn't get a chance to look a little closer at their bios. A couple of people in the background have asked questions about these links. I've got some links here. So this is a website called hydroschool.org/geomorphology. And if you have a look here, these are Grady's 2 videos that we talked about in that series with MRiver. And I've also got a link here to the practical engineering appearance on the Full Momentum vodcast here, which is the RAS Solution channel with Chris Goodell, who's with us today as well. Also, this Stage 0 Data Hub that you see here with all sorts of papers for those who are PhDs in the background. You'll have a lot to choose from here. Maybe start with this intro if you haven't been exposed to geomorphology or to sediment transport, numerical modeling of these things. Start with this, and then you can get into some of the papers in the background here. And we also have some courses available to you. Andy Markham is one of the key presenters, is on with us in the background today as well, answering some questions, and teaches this fluvial Field Geomorphology Essentials course. And what we want to know from you, from the audience today, the hundreds of people who have registered for this, let us know, should we go forward with additional modules about stage 0? We have some numerical sediment transport modeling courses, a whole bunch of additional free webinars for you on all sorts of topics that may be relevant, and then all of these papers. So you could spend hours here. We've got the memorial to Stan Shum, to a whole bunch of other things that you see here. There is basically an ancestry of all of those who are coming to you today, who they have learned from and who their mentors have been. And you can usually trace it back to some of these legends in the field. So I'll leave it there and stop my share, bring the panelists back on. One question, I guess, let's start with Colin, and then I do want to get back to those who are beginners to this field who have asked Grady a couple of questions. But let's start with Colin. I'm going to sum up about 8 of these questions here. And what I guess my experience here, you mentioned Mike Harvey as one of the authors of that paper. Mike and I, that's why I'm here in Perth. I came out to try to help the mining companies figure out what to do with these rivers when you put a mining pit in the way. Those mining pits, and a lot of times, are there in perpetuity. They're there forever. So here's a mining pit. Others asked about a dam, an upstream dam. When we have non-stationarity, the system established and became what it was at stage 0 because of a set of circumstances. It was what it was because of those circumstances. Now you introduce climate change and things like that, or you've got a dam, or you've got a mining pit. How does this knowledge that you've just presented to us, and again, this sums up a whole bunch of questions, I'm wrapping it all into one. How does the knowledge of what you've just presented to us help us when we're constrained? So over to you with that difficult question there, Colin.
Well, constraints, there's always constraints. Some of them are actually social and economic and in people's heads, and some of them are real. And you have to work out, is this really a constraint, or is it just inertia or reluctance to be innovative? Because those sorts of barriers, as I've shown with blue-green cities, can be overcome. However, when we say we're restoring to a stage 0 condition, we're not trying to go backwards and say that's how the river was and that's how it will be again. You can think of this as Control-Alt-Delete. Your laptop has got so many things going on and so many bits and pieces you've added to it. It's slowed down, it's bogged down, it won't do what it used to do. Control-Alt-Delete, reset the system. It's not going to stay like that. But when you reconnect a river to its valley, when you give it back multiple channels, you give it so many degrees of freedom that it can accommodate shocks. It can evolve in response to step changes in any variable and adapt. You give it the maximum adaptive capacity. And that's the best thing we can do for our rivers, because the future is not uncertain. It's unknowable because it hasn't happened yet. So we can't design for it. What we can do is make our rivers resilient and flexible and elastic so that it's very hard to break them. And these multi-channel systems don't have, like Richard Hay said, a single thread river has 9 degrees of freedom. 3-channel river has 27 degrees of freedom. That gives you about 13 million combinations of response that it can do. It can deal with the future if you give it the space and you give it the opportunity.
Oh, that's an excellent summary. I think you've just wrapped that up. And for those who ask specific technical questions, we're going to try and make a PDF of the Q&A available to the YouTube viewers, especially those in the US. Apologies that this got into the evening hours for some of you. It might not be ideal, but if you've tuned in later on the YouTube channel, you won't see the text, but go to the links in the description below and you'll see some of the Q&A. Now, Grady, I'll turn it over to you for a quick response, and I'll give everybody else a chance to just look through the questions, choose one that kind of encapsulates what you wanted to share today, and I'll ask you each for one response to those that you think have either been upvoted the most or those that you think are most relevant to your topic. So I'll come around to everybody individually. Grady, you've answered a few questions about the stream tables. Is there relevance here? I guess one of the main questions I saw is, these lateral constraints on it, like an alluvial fan would want to go farther. And sometimes you get that wall, just like in your 2D flood model that you and Chris have talked about on the RAS Solution channel. When you draw your perimeter, if all of a sudden the water ends up against that perimeter, you've introduced something that's not realistic. And we saw that happening on a few of those. What about the constraints on that? How applicable is this to a natural kind of braided system, or any other questions that you wanted to address that you've already hit in the background on the text? So over to you, Grady.
Yeah, and I didn't get a chance to spend a tremendous amount of time with the table, so I don't consider myself an expert in stream tables by any means, but definitely one of the constraints that I noticed, trying to communicate about some of the geomorphology, was that they can't really do suspended loads. So the sediment that does erode in the table doesn't make it very far downstream before it starts to deposit again. And so that's one of the big limitations of like trying to demonstrate the theory, lanes balance and stuff like that. Definitely the walls are too. But as I mentioned, it really is more of a teaching tool than a way to demonstrate how an actual stream would behave. And it's really just a way for people to see these processes evolve in real time. And it's just, that's just such a powerful tool. You know what they say about how many words a picture is worth. Well, to see a model that actually does the thing that you're trying to teach is just, it's invaluable, and it's just so cool too. So, so the limitations are worth it, I think.
Yeah, excellent. No, that's a great summary. So we're going to go in order then from Paul, Kate, and Janine, and then again. But again, if you are looking at trying to do numerical modeling of these processes, it is immensely more complex than doing flood modeling and just modeling water on a fixed bed. That's why we have additional courses in this, and we've got instructors who are with you in the background to answer some of those questions. If you are interested in trying to simulate this yourself, we start with just a straight flume, just trying to actually model a flume and get it to do what a real flume would do. So we're trying to depict reality just for one little straight section, cross section. It gets immensely complicated with feedback loops and everything else. Very quickly, it can become a chaotic system. So be very careful with that. It's great to have those visuals. If you take the geomorphology course that's offered through the Australian Water School on demand, you'll see Andy Markham and others introduce some stream tables that we've used here in Australia. I'll put some links to that on that website as well, so you can watch some of those in action. So over to first Paul, then Kate, then Janine. Find a question in the background, respond to our audience here, let them know what you've already responded to in text here. So over to you, Paul.
Apologies, I haven't been scanning the questions to answer one in particular, but I'll just step on Janine and Colin's toes here for a second. She'll probably answer much better, but to add a great deal of complexity to that stream table, the valleys that we've shared with you today don't really fall into that lanes balance equation either. They're more biology driven, right? It's the plants, it's the beavers, it's those organisms that shape the valley. So to add another major level of complexity to that stream table, I put a plug in. I think Colin's got a nice video from the University of Minnesota where they've planted it with scalable size vegetation, like a 30-meter long stream table. So it's really fun to watch that biological interaction there. And then I was going to touch on the infrastructure as well. We do have projects. Kate and I are working on projects. The one she's got in the background behind her is below a 400-foot tall dam, so very much a factor in that landscape. We have paved highways running down the valley, so and as well as quarries, so we can incorporate all those kind of things and restore that part of the landscape. And I'll hand it off.
Excellent. So over to Kate.
Yeah, I saw a question about monitoring in there. Yeah, so the question was, fisheries biologists or folks that are used to monitoring single thread channels. It's pretty easy. You got a pool and a riffle. They're easy to differentiate. So when we did our first stage 0 project, we use those same habitat metrics, pools, riffles, and how many pieces of wood. And so we complete a project like this behind me, and the protocol is to follow the main channel, the main stem channel, and measure those habitat features. And can you imagine doing that here? So after the first project, we were like, oh, wow, we have to completely change our monitoring approach to these projects. And so we've been trying to do that for several years now, with the help of a lot of researchers and grad students, and we're making some progress. So now we're really focused on indicators of restored processes instead of habitat units like pools and riffles. So we're more interested in distribution of velocities and distribution of depths and substrate size and geomorphic dynamism, deposition, you know, kind of indicators that this river is alive again and moving around. So yeah, monitoring has been interesting.
Excellent. Janine, any comments you wanted to respond
Well,
to?
there is an ongoing joke that every time we teach a workshop or I give a presentation, I always get questions about regulations, because I've worked in the regulatory environment for about 20 years. I worked within the Fish and Wildlife Service with no fisheries, and we implement the Endangered Species Act. But I also work very closely with the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. And so these questions came up: how do you get these projects through? And this isn't just applicable to projects within the United States, but anywhere, essentially on the planet where you're dealing with a government, you're dealing with regulated floodways. And it really, all of these projects, there was the design team, there was a group of folks, the regulators were involved right from the beginning. It's just, there's so much communication and managing expectations, and it takes years. These are not things that just like, oh, okay, this year we're going to go restore 2 miles of river. And so a lot of it is hearing concerns, taking them very seriously, doing the monitoring work. And something that I really appreciate working with various engineering firms is, we've come up with kind of our monitoring plans and our pre and post monitoring and so forth, but having contingencies and working with communities and saying, this is what we're planning on doing. And if there are problems, we are going to come back in and we'll be there for you. And there are ways to build that into a project, because almost all the projects that we work on are multi-year, multi-reaches. And so we go back year after year and we're always learning and we're adapting. And it's more than just adaptive management. It really is that commitment that you're going to be going back over time. And because you have to build that trust. Once you build the trust with that regulatory community and with, the communities that you're working in, you can get so much more done. And then the license plate that Paul had at the end of his talk, that was from landowners. They're landowners in Idaho who just loved the project so much they put it on their license plate. I mean, that is just incredible.
That's phenomenal. Well, I think we've touched on a wide spectrum of what goes into some of these projects and some of the concerns, some of the constraints, all of these considerations that we need to keep in mind. Chris, on behalf of the modelers, anything you wanted to say? This gets, like I said, very, immensely complicated very quickly. Can this be modeled numerically?
Well, there are a lot of great questions on the board today, most of which I was not qualified to answer. So I'm happy that our experts are here in restoration. But there was a specific question on modeling, and it was addressed to me, but I want to punt it to our experts, Janine, Kate, Colin, and Paul. The question is, what's the appropriate level of detail required to model this approach, say in HEC-RAS or any software program, to satisfy fish passage design? Now, I have my thoughts, between 1D, 2D, how do you model the wood? What level of resolution do you need in your computational mesh? And what about the resolution in your terrain? How do you incorporate the wood in your terrain, or do you? What are some of the things you guys are finding out about modeling this? Because I'm sure that you've been involved with that.
Yeah, if anybody wants to take a stab at that, those who need to run, if you came on for a 60-minute webinar and you're on your lunch break and need to get running, you will get the recording. But we're going to stay on for about another 5 minutes and have this continue this discussion here. We'll close it up shortly. But who wants to speak up on that one? First come, first serve. I hear Paul. Paul put his hand
Paul
up. So
should.
Paul,
Yeah, it's Paul.
yes,
All right,
let's have Paul address that one.
Well, I'm no modeler. I'll start with that, but I'll say that we've worked with folks who are taking their very best guess at modeling it in 2D and through the different flood stages. But it's a bit of a guess, and you're doing your best you can. So we are working with like the Bureau of Reclamation, and getting post-project bathymetric LiDAR, for example, in that project behind Kate, so they can reverse engineer the tool to make it fit what is actually observed on that landscape in different flows. Because when you take it out of the channel and make it interact with all that vegetation and wood, it gets really, really complicated in a hurry. So
Yeah,
more to come on that.
yeah, and I'm wondering, does anybody have any thoughts or ideas on, is it even possible to predict the evolution of the channel through the stage zero process, or is it just a big surprise when you see what happens?
Well, I think that's a great question, Chris. And what it comes down to is it's a bit like predicting the weather. You're not going to be able to predict the weather on any particular day in the future, weeks and weeks in advance, and certainly not months or years in advance. But you can predict the climate. And maybe that's the difference, is you wouldn't know where the channels are going to be exactly, or what their exact dimensions would be. But I think you could say how many channels there might be, and what the kind of makeup of the complexity might be in terms of not so much its central tendency, but its range of diversity. Because in these systems, they're very patchy, they're mosaics, but they're shifting mosaics. And as Janina said, they're more like kaleidoscope rivers, where you have the pattern of pieces of different habitats, islands, deep pools, riffles, bifurcations, confluences. You have all those pieces, but they're constantly shifting, because every flood that comes along rearranges them, but they're all still there. So I think the way to characterize these rivers is by their standard deviations and by their variability, and not by their central tendency. And I think that variability is an enduring characteristic that is predictable.
Excellent.
Yeah, and I will
Go
just add on to that. We get a lot of questions about fish passage, and we do have fish passage regulations that the water shall be, certain depth and velocities, and trying to model that, it's really quite difficult. And what we've come down to is, arguing that there are going to be multiple pathways for fish, and that's going to change over time. I think we're making some progress on that front, and it really is this kind of the heterogeneity of these reaches, where we see a lot of value. But there are situations where we have to build a primary channel of enough depth so that fish can migrate through. And it's hard to argue that we're putting things back and reconnecting these floodplains where the fish, they were just fine without us before we got here. But now there's this expectation that we will provide these pathways for them that they're supposed to use. And what we find is the fish are going in all sorts of different ways, in directions and across the floodplain. But I think this is just going to be an effort over time as people learn more about it. We have more projects on the ground, we have more monitoring, and that thinking will evolve.
Excellent. Okay, well, I think with that, we'll leave that as kind of the closing remarks there, and leave it at that, except to invite you all to the attendees to provide us with some feedback on what you want to see more of. Do you want to see more of this? Do you want to include this as a module in our geomorphology course? Should we do a separate course on this? Let us know with your feedback. Thanks so much to all of the presenters for coming on. Do watch Grady's videos if you get a chance to have a look at those. We actually use Grady's videos as introductory material for almost every course that we do. He's got something on every one of them. If you look at any course, any topic that we cover, there is a video that he's got that gives us a nice 5 to 10, maybe 15-minute summary of that topic for introductory for beginners, and gives us a chance to basically take it from the real world into some of these concepts that are a little more difficult to process. So thanks so much for all of our presenters. They've come to you today as volunteers. I hope it's been worth your while. We're glad to be able to bring you this sort of content. Do sign up for future Australian Water School courses and webinars, and help us shape our future with your feedback. You can see on your screen a couple of things coming up, and we look forward to further interactions with you. So again, thanks to all of our presenters, to the attendees. We'll see you again next time with the Australian Water School. Bye-bye.